You were told a six-figure salary meant you had arrived. That crossing that threshold was the finish line. For nearly half of Americans earning $100,000 today, it just means staying afloat. On paper, the economy has never looked stronger. In reality, the cost of living has outpaced wages for decades. To afford the same middle-class life your parents maintained on a single income in 1985, you would now need roughly 62 weeks of work crammed into a 52-week year. The middle class did not vanish. It simply started living on time it cannot get back. Chapter 1. The 62-week year. The American dream once had a straightforward definition. Work hard, earn a steady paycheck, and a stable middle-class life follows. The question today is whether that bargain still exists. Economist Oren Cass and his research organization American Compass built something called the Cost of Thriving Index to examine exactly that. The method is simple. Take one household, one basket of essentials, and ask how many weeks of full-time work it takes to cover them. The basket includes groceries, a modestly priced home at the 40th percentile, family health insurance, a car to get to work, and college for the kids, the baseline of an ordinary American life. In 1985, covering all of it took around 40 weeks. A typical middle-class earner paid for the whole basket and still had a fifth of the year left over. That surplus became savings, a down payment, a buffer against a rough patch. By 2022, the same basket consumed 62 weeks of pay, 14 months of labor to purchase 12 months of ordinary life. The shortfall is not circumstantial, it is structural. The cruelty is buried in the paychecks themselves. The 1985 worker took home roughly $443 a week. His 2022 counterpart earns around $1,200, nearly 3 times as much. On paper, he appears 3 times wealthier, but the cost of those essentials climbed faster than any raise ever could. The larger number purchases a smaller life. One income used to support a household. Now 2 paychecks barely cover what one used to. The American middle-class family absorbed an entire second earner and remained in the same position. So when a household appears stable, something is usually holding it together beneath the surface. A second job, overtime, gig work after the children go to sleep, a credit card bridging the distance between paychecks and rent. None of it is a lifestyle choice anymore. It is survival. This does not affect a narrow slice of families. In early 2024, research group PYMNDS found that 48% of households earning over $100,000 a year live paycheck to paycheck. Among households earning over $200,000, roughly 36% report the same. These are the Henrys, high earners, not rich yet. They carry salaries their grandparents would have called a fortune, backed by depleted savings and a retirement fund that keeps slipping further away. They followed every rule, did everything right, and are still falling behind. So, if the people near the very top are going under, who exactly is this booming economy booming for? Chapter 2. The GDP Ghost. The booming part is not entirely fabricated. The economy grew around 2% in 2025. Unemployment held low for an extended stretch. The S&P 500 kept setting records. By those measurements, everything reads as healthy. The problem is what those measurements leave out. GDP tracks the total value of goods and services produced. It tells you how large the economy is, not how far your paycheck stretches. Unemployment tells you whether a job exists, not whether that job covers rent, groceries, or basic stability. Both are useful tools. Neither answers the question people actually live with. Does working full-time still pay for a full-time life? Much of what we label growth is simply the staggering cost of staying in place. Many of the jobs being added sit in the service economy. Walmart, the country's largest private employer, pays roughly 1.6 million Americans. But those wages do not keep pace with rent or insurance. Since the late 1970s, the typical worker's pay has grown about 14.8%. Worker productivity over that same period rose roughly 64.6%. CEO compensation jumped over 1,300%. The gap between those producing the output and those collecting the reward has become a canyon. Economists sometimes describe post-recession recovery patterns as K-shaped. One line rises for those who hold assets. The other drifts lower for those who depend on wages. The same economy, 2 entirely different trajectories. The economy keeps expanding while the household budget keeps shrinking. People feel that gap even when they cannot put a name to it. For years, they have told pollsters the economy feels wrong, and the official data keeps insisting they are mistaken. Writer Kyla Scanlon calls this a vibe-accession, the distance between how the economy appears on a spreadsheet and how it registers at the kitchen table. Surveys from the University of Michigan track that mood staying pessimistic for years, even as headline indicators continue to rise. That disconnect is not random. It reflects what the indicators measure and what they quietly ignore. GDP and unemployment cannot capture the cost of holding a normal life together month after month, so the numbers move on charts and in press releases while they fail to register what people are actually experiencing. Chapter 3. The Big Four. You have been told you are better off than your parents because your things are better and cost less. The television is enormous. The phone in your pocket would have outperformed the 1985 supercomputer. Economists even adjust inflation calculations for product quality improvements, a method called hedonic adjustment, on the grounds that today's television or phone is superior to its predecessor. In practice, that improvement rarely translates into feeling wealthier. You might be able to afford a large 4K screen. What is harder is affording comfortable space to put it in, because the most consequential shift has not been in gadgets. It has been in housing. A home used to cost roughly 3 times a household's annual income. In many cities today, it exceeds 5. Take Austin. The price-to-income ratio reached about 5.75 in 2022. By mid-2025, it had cooled to around 4.31, still above its long-run average of roughly 3.9. And the obstacle is not just the monthly mortgage. A 20% down payment on a median-priced home can require around $80,000 upfront. That is a sum most renters cannot accumulate while simultaneously paying rent and everyday expenses. After the 2008 crash, Wall Street firms moved quickly to acquire foreclosed homes at scale. Blackstone eventually built Invitation Homes, which at its peak managed roughly 80,000 properties. Another firm, Progress Residential, grew to around 97,000. In Atlanta, institutional investors at one point controlled close to 25% of all single-family rentals. The starter home stopped being a rung on the ladder and became a yield-generating asset for someone else's portfolio. Childcare follows the same pattern. The federal government defines childcare as affordable at 7% of income, a threshold almost nobody actually clears. The average annual cost runs over $13,000 for a single child. 2 children pushes past $26,000 more than many Americans earn in a full year before taxes. In expensive metros, 2 children in care can consume 30 to 40% of a $100,000 salary. In 45 states, childcare now costs more than the average mortgage. In 38 states, it exceeds in-state college tuition. Then there is healthcare. In 2024, the average family plan costs close to $25,600. By 2025, it reached $27,000. Employees absorb roughly $6,300 of that directly from their paychecks. Over 5 years, premiums climb 24% while wages lag behind. Transportation compounds everything. By 2025, the average new car payment ran around $750 per month. Insurance alone topped $2,000 annually before a drop of fuel touched the tank. The system does not feel as though it is breaking. It already has. Chapter 4. The Debt Illusion. America's middle class is running on borrowed money. By late 2025, credit card balances hit a record $1.28 trillion, stack on roughly $1.66 trillion in auto loans and $1.65 trillion in student debt, and total household debt reached $18.59 trillion. Another all-time high. The mortgage sits above all of it. The cracks are appearing in places they should not. In 2025, more Americans in their 60s and 70s fell behind on credit card payments than at any point since 2010. A generation that was supposed to have already cleared the hardest terrain is now being caught in the same trap that ensnared the younger ones. But the detail that matters most is what the borrowing actually funds. Roughly 60% of cardholders carry a balance from month to month. In one recent survey, 55% said that balance exists to cover essentials: groceries, gas, the gap between the paycheck and the rent due date. When the majority of credit card debt is financing basic necessities, the conversation is no longer about reckless spending. It is a signal that ordinary income was never designed to close the gap that now exists. The debt has not layered on top of savings. It has replaced them. Interest then compounds on whatever remains. At rates approaching 20%, a $5,000 balance costs roughly $1,000 per year just to carry. Money that purchases nothing except the passage of time. That is why a single disruption can unravel everything. A medical bill, a sudden layoff, a car breaking down. The line separating a stable household from a missed payment has become extraordinarily thin. Chapter 5. The Doom Loop Algorithm. For most of history, people formed their sense of the economy from local evidence: their own job, their neighbors, the condition of the street they lived on. Now it arrives through a social media feed, ranked and filtered by algorithm. Those feeds have an agenda. They do not distribute information neutrally. They surface content that keeps users engaged, and anxiety tends to hold attention longer than reassurance. So the most alarming posts rise to the top. A round of layoffs at a major tech company. A video of someone crying in a parking lot after receiving a termination notice. One difficult week at one company starts to feel like evidence of a systemic collapse. This is sometimes called money dysmorphia, the distance between how you are actually doing financially and how financially precarious you feel. The algorithm widens that gap with every scroll. Performative wealth sits on one side of the screen. Economic doom occupies the other. Almost nothing in between communicates what ordinary looks like anymore. The design is intentional. A clip of a $400 grocery run generates millions of views. A video about a steady job and a manageable budget generates almost none. The platform surfaces the fear and buries the mundane. Over time, people begin to believe that everyone around them is collapsing and that they are next. It is easy to dismiss this as a problem with phones that misses what is actually taking place. This is not merely about distraction. It is about how information regarding the economy is now filtered and amplified at enormous scale. Public perception of economic conditions regularly diverges from individual financial reality. People can feel worse or better about the economy without their own income or bills changing at all. The clearest illustration appears after elections. The same underlying economic data gets interpreted radically differently depending on which party holds the White House. The numbers did not shift overnight. The emotional interpretation of them did. Worse still, perception becomes a feedback loop. Confidence does not just reflect economic conditions, it shapes them. When enough people brace for a downturn, they stop spending, postpone purchases, and hold back. The slowdown they anticipated begins to materialize. The real cost pressures feed the fear feeds the content, and the content amplifies both. At every turn, the platform collects its share. The feed determines your mood, monetizes it, and returns it to you as the news. Chapter 6. The Financialization of Survival. The things people need in order to live have been steadily converted into assets that generate returns for someone else. Housing is the most visible example. It is no longer simply shelter. It functions simultaneously as an investment vehicle, one that only works if prices keep rising. Rising prices, in turn, make it harder for the next person to afford entry. Pension funds and institutional investors channel money into housing markets to fund retirements, not yours. Higher education followed the same trajectory. Loan servicers collect on student debt for years after graduation. Schools receive payment upfront. The student continues paying well into middle age. Private equity kept expanding the perimeter, absorbing apartment buildings, mobile home parks, and hospital networks. Bright Horizons operates childcare as a publicly traded company. United Health, the largest health insurer in the country, generates some of the highest profits in the entire healthcare sector. What was once a neighborhood nursery and a family doctor's office now operates, at scale, as a revenue-generating line item. Workers produce more output each year. The gains land with whoever owns the assets, not with whoever performs the labor. The wealthiest 10% of Americans hold most of the stock market. The bottom half owns almost none. When asset values surge, the majority watches from the outside. None of this is a malfunction. The machine is doing precisely what it was constructed to do. It transfers wealth from labor to capital, year after year systematically. The worker is kept busy, paid just enough to continue, and handed the bill for everything the system cost them. The vibe session has become a perma-session, and the American dream is holding on by a thread. Chapter 7. The End of Progress. The American dream had a legible architecture. Each generation was supposed to stand a little higher than the one before. A home would accumulate value that outlasted its owners. Children would begin with more than their parents ever had. For the typical worker, that architecture has been demolished. The objective is no longer advancement. It is avoiding further decline. Holding position has become the entire ambition. Younger generations inherit the worst terms of the arrangement. Heavier debt, major life milestones pushed further back. The birth rate keeps sliding toward record lows, and the explanation is not some cultural shift away from family. People are being priced out of having children. The typical first-time homebuyer is now 40 years old, a record high. In the 1980s, they were in their late 20s. First-time buyers now represent only 21% of the market, the smallest share ever recorded. Many never buy at all. Increasingly, the home someone ends up in is determined by the wealth they inherit, not the job they hold. The wealth gap across generations tells the same story in reverse. Older homeowners hold properties that doubled or tripled in value during their lifetimes. Younger workers hold rent receipts and loan statements. The same country delivered two fundamentally different economies to its old and its young. The deficit, meanwhile, refuses to stabilize. The forces that push the cost of an ordinary life from 40 weeks of work to 62 are still operating, uninterrupted. Nothing is positioned to slow them. The economy will keep growing. Officials will gesture towards strong numbers in front of cameras, and those numbers will be technically accurate. But they will continue to miss what people are living through, because for millions of households, higher nominal incomes have not translated into feeling ahead, only into keeping pace with costs that move just as quickly. The real question is not about growth rates. It is about why a full year of full-time work no longer covers a full year of ordinary life. A vast share of housing and accumulated wealth in this country remains concentrated in a generation that built it under conditions that no longer exist. When those assets eventually transfer, the question of who actually benefits will matter enormously. Find out in This Will Happen After the Baby Boomer Generation Dies Off.